Good afternoon, good evening. I'm Bradley Graham, the co-owner, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, of Politics and Prose. And on behalf of the entire P&P staff, welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. We're truly delighted to have with us Timothy Snyder, a history professor and prominent scholar who's been on Yale's faculty for 17 years now. A specialist in Central and East European history, Tim, until last year, had been best known for his critically acclaimed histories of Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin, and Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning. Then a year ago, Tim came out with a slim volume called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And none of us has been sleeping very well since. The work became an instant bestseller, tapping into widespread concern in this country of Donald Trump's authoritarian tendencies and fears that his presidency would undermine American democracy and U.S. institutions. For that book, Tim drew on his own deep knowledge of what happened in Germany and the rest of Europe in the 20th century to caution against complacency, to encourage resistance, and to outline measures that we could take to help prevent repression. In his new work, The Road to Unfreedom, Tim shifts from describing how to resist authoritarianism to tracing the path of its recent resurgence. Originally conceived several years ago as a book focused largely on Russia and Ukraine, Tim expanded it in the wake of Trump's political success to examine how ideas germinated in Russia in the early 2010s spread through Ukraine and Europe to the United States. What he sees as a growing threat to our freedom is presented in the book also as a moment of opportunity, an opportunity to reassert the values and principles of our democratic order, values such as individualism rather than totalitarianism, truth rather than lies, and equality rather than oligarchy. Now, I'd guess, just to guess, that many of us in this room share Tim's abiding view that we're all passing through a crucial historical period when things could go one way or the other. Normally, historians write about the past, but as Tim has explained, he tried with The Road to Unfreedom to write a kind of history of a moment as it's unfolding, to convey how much agency and power we have to affect the outcome and to encourage us to embrace what he calls at the end the politics of responsibility. A review in Kirkus called the book, quote, a highly distressing, urgent alarm to awaken Americans to the peril of authoritarianism, and Publishers Weekly declared it, quote, a must-read for those concerned about democracy's safety in the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Timothy Snyder.
So when I stop talking, you'll have time to ask questions of me. But the question that I'm going to start out with is, what's this sleep business that people are so excited about, right? Like, as I see it, if you're not sleeping, then you're not sleepwalking, and sleepwalking is the way that things go wrong, right? So if you're not sleeping, you're not sleepwalking, and you have the possibility that you might be doing the right thing. What I'd like to, right? Yeah. What is this sleep thing? Okay, so the second thing I want to do is to remember to thank all of you, not just Politics and Prose, which feels like a second home at this point. I mean, a second home with a lot of people on the couch or on these chairs. Who knew this bookstore had this many chairs, actually? I suspect there's like a restaurant across the street which is missing some chairs at this point. But to thank all of you who have helped me along the way to think about this, and this is many of you, literally or in some sense collectively, people who've encouraged me, like Anthony Garrett, or people who read chapters like Vladimir Tismanianu, or in general the activists from Indivisible or from elsewhere, because a lot the last chapter of this book, the part about America, could only have arisen because I spent the last year since writing On Tyranny traveling around the country, talking to people and trying to figure out from them what we ought to be doing. Oh, I've got cousins here too. Hey. Um, um, so, so I want to start by thanking you, because this is a book about trying to figure things out, but it's a book about trying to figure things out, which was largely motivated by, you know, the good news that I saw people trying to do things. And the essential message of the book, which has already been described, is that the point of the history of the present is to know where you're standing. And if you know where you're standing, then you can choose which way you're going to walk. So I'm going to spend maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes talking about how I think this book is supposed to work, and try to leave plenty of time for you to ask questions of me. So this is a book which starts out with ideas about, oh, look at that microphone, with ideas about time. It's a book which starts with the intuition that there's something uncanny going on, that the things that are happening to us are not just bad, but that there's something weird, right? There's something bizarre. There's something unsettling. It's a bit like being on a ship where you can't quite ever get your sea legs, no matter how long you try. And the way that I characterize this in the beginning of the book, and then I use these terms throughout, is this notion of a shift from the politics of inevitability to the politics of eternity. The reason why I take the trouble to introduce this idea of time is that I think time is really important. I think time is not just a constant. I think time is a variable. I think the way that we experience time can change. By the politics of inevitability, I mean the notion, some people call it progress, the notion that somehow there are rules of history, and that no matter what you or I do, things are going to sort themselves out for the better, right? So, for example, you think that capitalism is going to create democracy, you know, and it's going to be fine, right? That's one version. There are other versions, right? That's a version that's been very popular in the US. And the thing about the politics of inevitability is that it eventually breaks, right? It eventually snaps. It eventually becomes implausible. It becomes incredible, right? For a lot of Americans, for a lot of people in this country, that was around the year 2008. For a lot of folks, I suspect, in this room, it was around 2016. But the notion that everything is going to sort itself out eventually breaks. One of the reasons it breaks precisely is inequality. So in our version of the politics of inevitability, the American version, or the American right-wing version, the notion that if you just let capitalism do its thing, democracy is going to be fine, right, generates spectacular inequality of wealth, which then makes events like the ones that we've just witnessed more likely. So what I'm trying to say in this book is that, I mean, where I begin is with the negation that history is over, right? I mean, I'm not just trying to ward off unemployment with that. Like, history really doesn't stop. I mean, you can say that it stops as much as you like. You can think that, like, they're just social scientific rules as much as you like, but it keeps going. And there are always alternatives, right? The kindred belief to history is over is that there are no alternatives. And that belief, there are no alternatives, is intellectually and, of course, morally deadening. Because if there are no alternatives, it doesn't matter what I do or what you do or what anybody does. And whether you're on the right or on the left, right? If you think there are no alternatives to this thing, what point is there to action? But of course, there are alternatives, and they snuck up on you. And the point of this book is to say there were things already going on which might have, well, I'm sure it alerted many of you, but which might have alerted us to the fact that history was actually continuing, right? So the second Iraq War of 2003, the financial collapse of 2008, Supreme Court decisions of 2010 and 2013, which actually made the United States less of a democracy than it had been before. These things were all going on before we get to the action of the book, which begins abroad. Now, ideas matter. This is the second point that I try to make in this book. Ideas, right? If you're in the politics of inevitability, one of the things you say is ideas don't matter, right? Whenever anybody comes up with something that looks like an idea, you say, well, you know, he may say that, but deep down he's just a pragmatist, right? I mean, how many times have we heard, how can you be deep down a pragmatist anyway? I've never understood how you could deep down. I mean, maybe on the surface somewhere, right? You know, Like my decision to wear a suit, right? Very pragmatic. I don't have to think about what I'm going to wear. I'm wearing a suit. That's pragmatic. But deep down, being right, I've never understood that argument. Like Putin seems like he has these ideas, but deep down, he's just a pragmatist. He just cares about money like you and me. And then the implication of that is, therefore, everything's going to be fine. Because so long as people only are pragmatists and care about their material interests, then everything's going to sort itself out according to the rules of history, right? So this whole notion that history is over, there are no alternatives, ideas don't matter, is deeply wrong. And that's why I start out the book with this long, painful, attention to philosophy. Because what I'm trying to show is that ideas have been here and that alternatives have actually emerged and that they matter in politics. So in the first chapter, I spell out the ideas of one particular advocate of what in the book I call the politics of eternity. So what are the politics of eternity? The politics of eternity are what happens when inevitability breaks. The politics of eternity says, look, let's not talk about the future. Let's talk instead about the past, okay? You don't have to be responsible because it turns out there are these patterns, these eternal patterns at really one, which is that we, the innocent nation, are always the victims of what other people are trying to do to us. There are cycles in the past. We used to be great. We used to be better than we are now, but somebody else has come and taken that away from us. And this happens over and over and over and over again, right? So this is a pattern which you might have noticed is slowly creeping into us, right? Retrospective slogans like "Make America Great Again" or explicit references to the 1930s like "America First" are just examples of a larger international pattern which actually clarifies itself first in Russia. The philosopher that I spend some time trying to explain was a Russian philosopher called Ivan Ilyin, who was a politician of eternity extraordinaire. Why do I pick him? I did not pick him because his collected works are 40 books, half in Russian and half in German, right? Like even my masochism has its limits. I did pick him because he is the philosopher who has been subjected to the most thoroughgoing rehabilitation of any thinker in the 21st century. His body was, his remains were reinterred, taken out of Switzerland to Russia. His papers were taken from Michigan State back to Russia. His entire body of work has been republished, and more to the point, he's been cited consistently over the course of a decade and at critical points by the president of the Russian Federation and by other important politicians in Russia. We have not noticed this because ideas don't matter, right? He's just a pragmatist. But at every crucial point, and especially around the 2011-2012 elections, when Putin comes back to power for real with new ideas, he's citing this philosopher. The politics of eternity here mean, I'll make it very simple here, they just mean we're innocent. The same thing happens over and over and over again. And in the original articulation of this, the basic meaning was fascist. Okay, that's a word that gets used a lot. He was just a fascist, right? Not in the sense of like you bad person, you fascist, but in the sense that he was actually just a fascist. He was a fascist. But in the 20s and 30s and 40s when he wrote, he was a fascist. But in his rehabilitation, he serves a slightly different function. These ideas that we're just innocent and the same thing happens over and over again have been rehabilitated for the use of the Russian oligarchical clan, which is in charge, right? The Putin clan. And these ideas are extremely convenient if you happen to be the people who already control the wealth. Because what you're doing is you're explaining why there can't ever really be change. We never actually need to think about the future. Whatever happens in politics is a result of the fact that the bad people outside are always coming for us innocent people inside. And if you listen to the tonality or just the content of what Russian diplomats are very often saying now, this captures it quite well. No matter what it is, it turns out that it's actually the other side which is constantly after us because we're innocent, basically. And there's one other very convenient feature of Ilyin as a fascist philosopher. What Ilyin says is, the factuality of this world counts for nothing. This entire world, the one we live in, this world of our facts and passions, this world counts for nothing. This world is broken, right? The only truth is the whole truth of God. Ilyin has the interesting but distressing idea that God did create the world, but he got it wrong, right? Which is an interesting version of Christianity, the result of which is that not so foreign from certain Russian traditions, by the way, but which has the consequence that everything in this world is sinful and wrong. Therefore, the things that we regard as facts are not true. The only thing which is true is God's totality. And the only way to restore God's totality is to start by building up a totalitarian Russia. Now, that view is very convenient because it means that if you dismiss factuality, right, let's say you're an oligarch in charge of Russia right now. If you dismiss factuality, you're not doing anything wrong, right? There's nothing wrong with that because this world is already sinful. The only true thing, the only good thing is the totalitarian rehabilitation of your own country, right? This is an idea, and it's an example of how a politics of eternity can work. When do you need something like this? Well, this is something I try to explain in chapter 2, which is about succession. There are many problems with oligarchy. One of the problems with oligarchy is the absence of a succession principle, okay? Which raises the question, why do we like democracy so much? I'm going to give like an unbelievably conservative and boring answer. The reason why democracy is such a good thing is that it gives you a rational succession principle. It allows you to know that your state is going to continue because the elections that are going to come around the next time will mean that your country is still going to be there in the background. The beauty of democracy is not so much about rights and all those nice things, which I also believe in. The beauty of democracy is that it transforms our individual fallibility into a collective sense that the political unit goes on, right? So we can all vote for the wrong person and then we can blame him or her, right? Our individual fallibility becomes our collective, sense that it's somebody else's fault, and then we get to do it all again, right? Now that's a very down-to-earth description of democracy, but the beauty of that is that there's no end to the time horizon. Right? There's a succession principle. And the succession principle is these leaders get replaced by the next leaders when we all vote the next time, which we can take for granted until it stops. When it stops, when there's no succession principle, time also stops, right? No one knows what's going to happen when Putin dies. And no one in Russia can talk about that. That is a situation which is very difficult, right? What do you do in that situation? There's an answer, and the answer is the leader with his amazing charm or his charisma does away with the whole question by generating, enthusiasm and by generating spectacles. That's how the politics of eternity works. Eternity's not about forever. It's about now, over and over and over and over again. So if you have a succession problem, and you can't talk about it, what you do instead is you generate spectacle by invading Ukraine or by intervening in Syria or by causing trouble in the European Union and the United States. I'm going to talk about Europe and the US in a minute, but from the point of view of Russian domestic politics, what all of this stuff which affects us so intimately amounts to is spectacle and a sense that Russia is the victim over and over and over again. Now, if you get down to the details of all of this, when Putin comes back to power in 2011, 2012, it doesn't look like his party does very well. It also doesn't look like he gets as many votes as he was expecting to get. And right there at the beginning of 2012, Putin begins to argue, often actually citing this philosopher Ilyin, that this is all the Americans' fault. This is all the Europeans' fault. These protesters on the street, that's Hillary Clinton. Right? These protesters on the street, that's the European Union. And we have to have an answer to this. And the answer that he gives is something which he calls Eurasia. Okay, so what's Eurasia? Looking at it from the Russian point of view, it's a series of very interesting philosophical traditions, which I try to describe in chapter 3, some of which come from native Russian far-right sources, some of which come from European fascist or Nazi sources. But the idea of Eurasia is we can have European integration on the basis of not the rule of law, not prosperity, not democracy, but on the basis of what Putin calls civilization, right? So basically, we can have a dictators club where we tell each other how wonderful we are and how virtuous we are, right? Because we embody civilization. This is meant as an answer to the European Union. Why is the European Union so boring? Because the European Union, there are many answers to that question, but and I don't have so much time. But the reason why it's boring is that the European Union is precisely about the rule of law. Right? The rule of law is about making politics boring so individual life can be interesting. So which is, if you have to choose, which do you choose? Do you choose to all right. So the point of Eurasia is to say, you know what? Russia's never going to be like Europe. We're never going to have the rule of law that way. We're never going to have predictable politics based in democracy, but we've got something else. We've got virtue. We've got civilization, right? And then Russia begins to support other people who talk along the same lines, whether they are neo-Nazis, whether they are fascists, whether they are far-right populists like the Front National in France or the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. Russia begins to support people and movements like, for example, Brexit, which aim at weakening the European Union, right? This is Russia's policy. If you look at it from the point of Europe, you see a vulnerability, a tremendous vulnerability, because Europeans, like Americans, have a politics of inevitability that they've been dreaming in, just like we've been dreaming in for the last 25 years or so. Theirs is different. Theirs says something like this: we, the Europeans, unlike the Americans, we are very wise. Right? It's okay. We, unlike the bellicose Americans who never learned from war, we learned from the Second World War that war is a bad thing. And we have taught ourselves this, and as a result, we've carried out this very sensible policy of economic cooperation. Okay, that sounds nice, right? And you've heard Europeans say that. It's false. It's false from A to Z. Everything about that is wrong. The Europeans did not learn from the Second War that war was a bad thing at all. If they had, the Jews, the Belarusians, and the Russians and the Ukrainians would be the most pacific people in the world because they're the ones who suffered during that war, right? But more to the point, the West European powers who actually start the European Union, they start it not because they lose Second World War, but because they lose colonial wars. Okay, this is the deep, dark secret of European history. European history is written as though there were nation states, and those nation states got into a Second World War and learned stuff. No. There were empires, and those empires broke up, and when they broke up, Europe was where you landed. That's what the European Union is for. You get to lose your empire, you get to not talk about losing your empire, let alone all the atrocities involved, and you get to land in this big trading space, and then you talk about how you're nation states, and you learn from the Second World War, and it's great. Okay, and the reason why this starts with Germany is that the Second World War was a colonial war, where Germany tries to be an empire except in Europe rather than around the world. Now, why am I dwelling on this making fun of the Europeans aside from its inherent pleasure? Because this is the vulnerability of the European politics of inevitability. If you really think, and Europeans really think, unless you make them think about it for 15 seconds and then they stop, they really think that they had nation states, and that these nation states learned. They didn't have nation state, or in the case you're European, you, unless you're Finnish, and I'll give you like a pass, or Danish, but you didn't have a nation state. Ever. You had an empire, and then you lost the empire, and then you landed in integration. There is no moment, right? There's not even a second where you were a nation state in between. If you believe you're a nation state, you had one, that means you're vulnerable to ideas like Brexit, right? You're vulnerable to the idea that, oh, we could leave the European Union and go back to being a nation state, and that would be fine. Right? Many Europeans think that, but there's no reason to think that whatsoever, historically speaking. So what Russian propaganda does is, like there as here, it spins the ball, right? It pushes people towards their own vulnerability. Russian politics is to say, yeah, sure, go back to being a nation state. It'll be great. Right? And so with Brexit, right, a huge proportion of the political conversation about Brexit on Twitter was carried out by Russian trolls and bots, as precisely nobody in Britain knew at the time. Right? And that vote was turned by 2%. So this is chapter 3. This is the European politics of inevitability and how it creates vulnerability. Because of course, once you leave, if you do leave the European Union, I mean, I hope I'm wrong about Britain. I hope I'm wrong about all this. But if you leave the European Union, then you go back into a politics of eternity, where you talk about, yes, there was Britain, there was cricket, you know, it was wonderful, long shadows, and so on. Okay, now. Ukraine plays a very important role in this book, but not in itself, but because Ukraine reveals so much about how Russia was thinking about Europe and the United States. The reason why there is a revolution in Ukraine in 2013 and 2014 is that the Ukrainian government said that it was going to move towards the European Union and then changed its mind. The reason why first students and then other people rebelled against that change of heart was precisely the rule of law, the thing we take for granted, but the thing that Ukrainians do not have and understand that they need, since it, like Russia, is one of the most corrupt political economies in the world, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. So that's the real story, okay? That's the super boring story, which I try to tell with art and detail in the book, right? But the super boring story is that these students and these other people who end up risking their lives and building really interesting new kinds of politics while they're doing it over the course of months of protests, the thing that starts the protest, the thing they care about is predictability, the rule of law, a European future. Okay, that's not as exciting as the Russian story. What's the Russian story about? The Russian story about Ukraine, which we found very interesting, it's about civilization. It's about Russian culture. It's about speakers of Russian. It's about ethnic Russians. It's about a Russian world. It's about a Ukraine that's divided between East and West that you can draw on maps with a line going down the middle with one side one color. You remember this, right? Because our entire press did this for like 6 months, okay? That's the Russian politics of eternity. The idea that politics is not about interests and preference and people thinking about things and making choices about the future, but about eternal verities of civilization, like what language you speak, which supposedly determines what ethnicity you are and therefore what eternal future you must have again and again. The Russian propaganda victory over us and over the Europeans in 2014 was this. It was the politics of eternity in operation. That's the logic of it. And of course, there was also the technique. The technique was worth noting because a lot of things which happened in 2014 in Ukraine are also happening at the same time in Europe or in the United States, right? So for one thing, the logical business. So when anything, everybody's now noticed this, but whenever Russia is caught doing something, the response is to issue multiple contradictory forms of denial, which is a strategy, because the idea is to encourage you to think, who knows really, right? It could be that, it could be this, it could be the other thing. I don't trust the Russian media, but I don't trust the American media anyway. Who knows, right? That's a strategy, right? That's a weapon. They're doing this in Ukraine when they say the Ukrainians are nationalists, but there's no Ukrainian language. The Ukrainian state's very oppressive, but it doesn't exist, right? And so on and so forth. All these things which we didn't really notice at the time. They do this in Ukraine, and then they're going to do it everywhere else as well. When they deal with Ukraine, when they invade Ukraine, they push this to a kind of interesting extreme where, as far as I can tell, maybe someone else can contradict me, but this is at least one of the few wars I can think of where an actual conventional war is prosecuted, and the people who are prosecuting the war deny that it's happening. I mean, sometimes you go for the element of surprise, right? Like for a day or two, but to actually invade a country 3 times and then deny that you're doing it. Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 14, in August of 14, in January of 2015 on a pretty large scale and denied that it was doing it, right? Totally denied that it was doing it. And there's a point to this, which is to make us doubt, right? To make us doubt everything. What are journalists and reporters supposed to do with a head of state who sends his own army to invade a country and then says, no, I'm not doing it. Here's the temptation, which we fell for. The temptation is to cover him and his interesting denials, right? Because what he is doing is he's transforming reality into a reality television show, and what's not happening is the death of thousands of people or the violation of a European legal order, right? That's not happening. What's happening is the very interesting spectacle of Putin denying that that's what's happening. That's so much more tempting to cover, right? And again, that foreshadows what was happening or what was going to happen with our politics. There are also many more direct foreshadowings, like, for example, the Ukrainian presidential elections of 2014, where Russia hacks the server of the Ukrainian Central Electoral Commission to get the result that a nationalist who actually had only won less than 1% was the winner, right, which the Ukrainians caught at the last moment. But the Russians hacking the server of an electoral commission might have been the kind of thing which drew more attention than it did at the time. Oh, and by the way, they also hacked Ukrainian utilities in 2015, 2016, and the very software with which they did that was planted in American utilities at the same time. And by the way, if we get the chronology straight, 2014, when Russia is invading Ukraine, is also when the Internet Research Agency starts getting ready to support Donald Trump. 2015, a couple of days after he announces his candidacy, when the war in Ukraine is going on, is when the Internet Research Agency creates its American division and starts these operations, which we now all know something about. The chronology is also extremely revealing, and that's not even to mention, right, that the main political advisor of the outgoing Ukrainian president, the one who was rather pro-Russian and the one who was against European integration, was Paul Manafort, who was then next seen, right? And I just give him as an example because there are a number of characters who are in both these worlds at the same time, who was then next seen as the main political advisor of, you know, so by the time we get to 2016, where we begin to sort of notice that things are happening around us that are strange, what I'm trying to do in the book is make 2016 make a lot more sense, right? What I'm trying to do in the book is make it make sense. By the time we get to 2016, we have the sources of the politics of eternity in the US. We have the politics of eternity as ideology coming from Russia. We have a succession crisis in Russia, which articulates itself in foreign policy towards Europe and towards the United States, with the export of domestic problems. We have a war in Ukraine, which is very interesting and very revealing of what war in the 21st century is going to be about. Many, many similarities, some of which I've already mentioned. But we also have something else which is already going on, which is the presence, I have to name his name, which is the presence of Mr. Trump. Mr. Trump is in this story no later than 2013. In 2013, when the Russian Federation is beginning to present itself as the champion of Eurasia and as the source of virtue and conservatism, by which is very often meant nothing more than heterosexuality, right? Trump's contribution to heterosexuality, i.e. virtue, is the Miss USA pageant in the suburbs of Moscow in 2013. And it's a very important moment. It's a revealing moment in a lot of ways. In terms of personnel, some of the people he's talking to there will be the same people who help him in 2016. But more than that, it gives us a sense of how Mr. Trump fits into these larger developments as a kind of fictional character. So the crucial thing about Mr. Trump is that he fits the politics of eternity so well. What the politics of eternity says is none of these factual things are really true, right? Time is going to stop. We're all going to be entertained or maybe outraged by an ongoing daily spectacle. The perfect character for this sort of thing is someone like Mr. Trump. Donald Trump, successful businessman, is not a real person, right? That person doesn't exist. In a lot of different ways, that person doesn't exist. That is a fictional character who has become our president. And the reason why that's related to Russia is that Mr. Trump and Russia come together over precisely this. Mr. Trump is a failed businessman who plays a successful businessman on TV. And this is really confusing for us, right, as a society. So I'm going to pause on this because I know a lot of successful businessmen, and I love you all, right, those of you who are here, and not a single one of you can play a successful businessman on TV, right? Because those are two entirely different skill sets. Those are two entirely different skill sets. They are. And yet the fact that someone plays a successful businessman on TV nevertheless somehow gives us the idea that maybe he is a successful businessman, which he isn't. He's a serial failure, but he's rescued. No, in terms of like grand finance, he's an American loser, right? But he is rescued by Russia. He's rescued by Russia, which makes it plausible for him to present himself as a successful businessman. Russia makes the fiction plausible, and then Russia helps to get that fiction elected president of the United States. But I want to pause here, and the last thing I want to say before I conclude is just to repeat: we made ourselves open to this. Right? The space where Mr. Trump and Russians met was the open, unregulated part of capitalism, which existed thanks to our politics of inevitability. Our crazy idea that the freer the capitalism, the better the democracy, right, is the kind of thing which leads to anonymous real estate deals, shell companies, banks doing business with clients who they can't name, all of which things were necessary steps in the creation and the promotion and the election of Mr. Trump. I spell out how in the book. Our faith that technology was always going to be enlightening. Again, our politics of inevitability opens us up to a moment where platforms like Facebook and Twitter can be used to bewilder and to confuse and to demotivate and to polarize, which also happens. Our crazy belief that we can let the market handle healthcare, which is one of the most barbaric ideas, right? 100 years ago, people knew that wasn't true. 100 years ago, people were already talking about healthcare as a universal right? That crazy idea opens us up to, for example, an opioid crisis, which we look away from. And that has the interesting consequence, and I try to explain this in the book, but every single county in Pennsylvania that Trump flipped from Obama is an opioid crisis. Every one. Every county in Ohio, except for one, that he flipped from Obama is an opioid crisis. He does very well in counties where the life expectancy, especially of white males, is going down. In the places where there are deaths by despair, he wins, right? I try to explain how this all fits together with the politics of eternity, but if you expect a lot more, right? If you're white males and you're particularly prey to the politics of inevitability because the American dream is above all your dream, that's what you think, even if you wouldn't say it, you are then particularly vulnerable to getting hit when things don't go well, to being shocked, and to falling into cycles of seeing the same thing over and over and over again, of which, by the way, opioid addiction is one. That's what opioid addiction is like. It's being in eternity. It's the same thing over and over and over again. Okay, so we open ourselves up to this in all of these different ways, and structurally. Now, I'll make a quick point about dark globalization. We think, so part of the politics of inevitability is we think globalization is America, right? America being projected on the rest of the world. That's what globalization is. We've got it right, and everybody eventually is going to figure it out, right? That's globalization. Okay, now, if you're looking, there's some obvious critiques to make of that, but I'm going to make a slightly less obvious one. What if America, rather than being a liberal democracy projecting itself around the world, is actually becoming less democratic? Which it is, which it was already. And what if certain things which we just take to be our own, like homegrown, obscure specificities, like gun ownership, or the electoral college, or racism, things that we think of as ours, what if those things from abroad look like obvious attack surfaces? Which they are, right? If you are trying to use globalization to wreck the democracy or the rule of law of the United States, of course you make an alliance with the NRA, which Russia did. Of course you sow discord around shooting attacks, as Russia does. Of course you concentrate your attention on crucial electoral college states like Michigan and Wisconsin, as Russia did. And of course you pitch a lot of your Facebook advertising along racial divides, as Russia did. You take advantage of the structural problems which are already present. So I think it's right to say that Mr. Trump is the payload of a Russian cyber weapon. But we, as the ones who were defeated by that weapon, have to ask why we were so easy to defeat. And that's where the book tries to conclude. I try to make it make sense that it's all the above, okay? So Americans are asking, like, is it Russia or is it us? Like, and if it's us, then, especially people on the left, if it's us, then we don't have to pay attention to Russia, which is, nice, because a lot of people on the left would just kind of like to pay attention to us and how it's always our fault, and it's not always our fault. Only 88.5% of the time is it our fault. Sometimes it's other people's fault. Or more interestingly, Russia is like the bad doctor, right? The doctor who diagnoses you in order to make your ailments worse, okay? Nevertheless, the stuff on his clipboard is really interesting because the diagnosis is more or less correct. And so the sense for us of the successful Russian cyber attack, which led to the creation and the election of Donald Trump, the sense of that for us is that it shows us what we have to fix. right? You cannot choose. You cannot say it was Russia or it was us. The whole sense of understanding what Russia did to us is to understand us. So of course it makes sense to change these platforms. Of course it makes sense to have cyber defense. That all makes sense. But what makes more profound sense is to use this as an opportunity to see where we actually are in history and to start rebuilding from below. So I've talked for longer than I meant to, and I still have so many things that I wanted to say to you, but I would rather now hear from you. So thank you very much. Go ahead.
All right. So this is one of those comment questions, but I want to hear your reaction to the comment.
Okay.
You've framed your argument in terms of certain sort of philosophies, the politics of inevitability and things like that. I have heard sort of what you were calling the deeply pragmatist view. So why did Russia invade the Ukraine? Well, the Ukraine's the Russian breadbasket and they have warm water ports. Why are they having cyber war against us? Because they're rooted in sort of Marxist conflict philosophy. And what do? Well, the West, the people putting, missile defense on your borders, that's your bad guy. How do you go after us? Bad doctor strategy, right? And that's very different from an overarching philosophy. It's sort of like the pragmatist. Well, we need that resources in Ukraine, and we're going to go after our enemies, right? How do you respond to a different perspective on all of this? It's sort of a comment question.
Yeah. So one of the things that I try to do in the book, which I can't repeat here, is actually tell a history of the 2010s. So here I'm kind of giving highlights and lowlights. But one of the things that I try to do in the book as a historian is to put it all in chronological order. And certain things, when they're in chronological order, come clearer than they might have been otherwise. So for example, with Russia and Ukraine, it's my conviction that the drastic Russian turn on Ukraine has much more to do with the drastic Russian turn on Europe than it does with anything else. I think the stuff about Russia's internal blah, 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 is like, one should be very suspicious of that. Not that people don't believe it now, but for 23 years, Russia didn't make a single objection about human rights in Ukraine, right? Not a single one. No official, never once did the Russian Federation say that Ukraine, for example, is mistreating a member of a minority. For 23 years, Russian international lawyers were obsessed with territorial sovereignty and the integrity of borders. And then it changes at a certain point. I don't think it's easy to connect that with anything that that we were doing, which isn't to say we don't do bad things, right? I mean, invading Iraq, for example, which I mentioned at the very beginning of the book, I think has a lot to do with all of this, and especially our inability to consider what it meant to invade Iraq. But I think the chronology shows that Ukraine was more a subsidiary part of this much broader turn. Now, is it philosophy or is it pragmatism? I've had to go at that one way. I'm going to have to go at it a different way. The way that I would characterize Russia's view on this was something like strategic relativism. So it's not that it's not pragmatic, it's that it's pragmatic according to a different overall set of values. And that set of values says, we are, the Russians wouldn't, Mr. Putin wouldn't put it this way, but I am the head of an oligarchical clan. I control the resources. There cannot be rule of law in my country. We do not have great technological innovation. So what do I do in politics, right? What I do in politics is I try to convince domestically my constituents that it's the same everywhere else, which is that's the main message of Russian media. Not propaganda one way or the other, but everywhere you look, it's the same. The British are corrupt, the Americans are corrupt, everybody's corrupt. They're corrupt the same way that I'm corrupt, right? We're all corrupt in the same way. And this is interesting because it's nationalist. Because if everybody lies and everybody's corrupt, you should love your own lies and corruption better than someone else's, right? And that's how it turns back to nationalism. That's how it actually works. And so what you do abroad is this kind of strategic relativism where with the expenditure of relatively few resources, you try to break down the institutions which make the European Union and the US look better. The entire Russian cyber budget costs less than an F-35. Which would you rather have, right? Which could you have more fun with or more guilty fun with, right? Unless you're in severe masculinity crisis, the answer is Russian cyber budget. So it's pragmatic in that sense, right? It's budgetarily pragmatic, but it's also pragmatic in the sense that there is a kind of goal. It's just not a positive one, right? It's not that Russia's trying to make the world in a certain way. It's that Russia's trying to unmake the world so that things look more like Russia in the end. So as far as as far as the ports, Russia had a treaty with Ukraine, which was going to allow it to use those ports until 2052, which incidentally meant that Ukraine could not join NATO until 2052 at the earliest, right? So these arguments, which suddenly have great force about the ports and about NATO because Russia makes them, they didn't make any sense. Russia had a treaty with the sitting president, which Ukraine had signed, which said you have those ports till 2052, right? And as for it's true that Ukraine's a breadbasket, but the Donbass just has coal, which Russia doesn't need. Anyway, I gotta move on. Thanks.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. I grew up in communist Poland and came here in '91, a year and a half after communism fell. I wanted to really forget my life in Poland, and I thought that I did until Trump was elected. And the similarities between the communist regime of Poland of 70s and 80s, and what is happening in this country scares me probably a little bit more than the rest of this room. I started thinking about capitalism a little bit more because of Trump. I wrote 4 essays and published about Trump and communist Poland. But I realized that maybe democracy is not as strong as I believed it was. Examining, for example, what happened with Nixon, if not for the tapes, he would never resign. Am I correct?
Okay.
So it was just a fluke that the tapes existed and that they were revealed. So
Okay.
I would like you to tell me that democracy is well and
Okay. All right. So
because I have nowhere to go. I mean, I
Okay.
can't.
yeah.
I want to
yeah.
stay here. Thank you.
No, don't get me started on Poland. So, okay. So I'm going to make a couple points. The first is to your introduction. Since I wrote On Tyranny, or even before I wrote On Tyranny until now, it's been very interesting to me who has gotten in touch with me about their anxiety. And also it was interesting to me in 2016 who called the Trump election correctly. So who has gotten in touch with me? Many immigrants from Yugoslavia who saw 2016 as being like Milosevic. Many Holocaust survivors and the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, some of whom have actually done wonderful things, or we've done wonderful things together thanks to their initiative. Interestingly, another group of people in 2016 who saw it coming were Russian and Ukrainian journalists who weren't getting a lot of airplay here, but were pretty consistently predicting that he was going to win, or at least warning us that this kind of thing could work. And so this is fortunately or unfortunately a kind of renaissance of the kind of parallel that you're making. And it's people who have some experience and one foot in that part of the world who are often seeing this the best. As far as democracy and how it works, I can't be like I can't quite be cheerleader here, but what I do think is you've already signaled something important with Watergate, which is, first of all, investigative journalists. If there hadn't been the tapes, there would have been some other thing. There were journalists who were pushing on it, and they were finding things out. And this is why this book is dedicated to journalists. Basically, everything important we know about Trump is thanks to investigative journalists. And the things that we know about the larger problem around Trump are one of the ones I try to identify, which is the offshoring. Right? It's hard to exaggerate how important this is. When I say offshore, you think Cayman Islands. When I say offshore, Russians think United States, United Kingdom, right? Because of Anglo-Saxon law, we are basically one giant English-speaking offshore site for these people. And if it weren't for that, Mr. Trump would not exist, because he was the enthusiastic vehicle for all of this. But my point about that is that we know that Mr. Ross, has holdings in a company which did business with Russian crony capitalists close to Mr. Putin because of the Paradise Papers, right? We know things thanks to journalists. We have a chance at getting our minds around inequality and related issues because of journalists. As for democracy will work when the rule of law works. It will work the way I described when the rule of law works, which is why we have to just hold on with everything we've got, fingernails, whatever, to the rule of law. It's not. I can't tell you that democracy is just going to be fine, because that's just not what history says. There are elements to it, and this is one of these moments where we have to hold up whatever part of it that we're capable of holding up. Okay, I gotta let you.
Yes, I don't want to take any more time. But we will not be okay with investigative journalism if the internet allows for everyone to speak and for other people to,
It is a
It's a
major theme of this book, what you just said. Yeah, I write a lot about this. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 about cyber politics are all about this. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Two quick questions,
Yeah.
and hopefully this is in the book. So first, the politics of inevitability versus the politics of attorney. I think that's a very useful frame. But what's the alternative? What's the
Right.
middle ground? What are we seeking? Because it's not a left-right thing, because there's politics of inevitability on the left.
Correct.
Marxist,
Correct.
Leninist historicism that Karl Popper debunked very effectively, poverty of historicism. Second quick question is, back to On Tyranny, rule number 5, be calm when the unthinkable arrives. I'm convinced it's highly likely we're going to have our Reichstag fire sometime between now and the midterm election. Be calm, don't fall for it. Great advice, necessary but not sufficient. What else? What else should we do
Yeah.
when the unthinkable arrives?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, in a way, you've actually performed the answer to your second question, because what I tried to do by putting that in there, and when I had my first big chance to talk to millions of people, which was the Bill Maher show, March a year ago, I used that. I chose that lesson because if you think about it, it's no longer unthinkable. And if it's no longer unthinkable, then it's not so much of a shock. And if it's not so much of a shock, then you're not so vulnerable. So this is meant to be a self-defeating prophecy. I think we have to realize that we're in a world of politics, as you say, like Germany was in 1933 or like Russia was in 1999, when surprising things can open an aperture of emotional vulnerability, which allows for regime change. Yeah, it could happen. But once we recognize it could happen, then we're starting to prepare ourselves for it, right? Once we know it could happen, we don't have an excuse to be shocked anymore. That's honestly my best answer. And the more that people realize that it's not going to be a shock, the less likely they are to actually try it, right? On the first question, this is where the book lands. So again, in the presentation, I can't give the whole empirical narrative, nor can I give the whole moral narrative, but the book is meant to have both. So each chapter is about a virtue. Each chapter is basically about a country, a year, an event, but also about a virtue. And the device is to show that when an institution is challenged, it reveals what the virtue was that stood at the origin of that institution, which that institution defended. And as the institution dissolves, it's like we can see in the midst of its dissolution what that virtue actually is if we look, right? And so the moral gain from trying to figure out where we are is that we see what these virtues actually are. And it's important for me that we talk in terms of virtues. I mean, the last two words in the prologue, if I remember right, are good and evil. I'm trying to show us that we can see that there are moral alternatives. And so the whole book works towards the answer to your question. And the answer, what I call it at the end is the politics of responsibility. So at the moment where you figure out where you're actually standing is the moment where you realize what you can and can't do. And it's at that point where you become responsible, because you're no longer mystified by inevitability or eternity, which have the thing in common that they both do away with responsibility, right? If everyone's coming to get us all the time, then all we have to do is rally, right? Or if everything's going to be fine no matter what we do, then all we have to do is consume or whatever. And you're right that there are left-wing versions of this. But so both of them, their alliance is at that moment of absence of responsibility. So what I try to do in the book is end on that point, and the epilogue is about this. The epilogue is about what it would be like to reconstruct those virtues into responsibility. So thanks for that.
I'd like to ask, what would you propose we should do to hit back at Putin? Very severe financial sanctions, cyber attacks, whatever you might think of that would make him back off.
Okay, so I've already actually answered that question. I'm gonna reformulate it. There's not a whole lot you can do in terms of offensive cyber. And by the way, offensive cyber is kind of a dangerous thing. So one of the reasons why there's a very twisted tale of offensive cyber, right? Where we, the United States, are thinking about it. We, the United States, hire subcontractors in California to work up some techniques. Those subcontractors in California talk to a company called Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica then ends up harvesting the data of at least 50 million, maybe 80 million Americans. And the shoe that's going to drop next is that one of the purchasers of that data was the Russian Federation, right? That's the shoe which I imagine is going to drop. next. So one has to be if you're the United States, you have to be very careful with offensive cyber, because it's like developing a disease to which you have very weak resistance, in which a country like Russia has very strong resistance. Because, why? Because first of all, the internet is not a free-for-all there like it is here. Second of all, far fewer people there use it for news than we do. Third of all, they've got like 1 million people who speak bad English, which it turns out is good enough for us, right? We like bad English, it turns out. Like, if you read like 10 GOP or, the Texas secession site, like the English is really bad, but nevertheless, like we went for it. We don't have 1 million people who speak bad Russian. So it would be very hard for us to get in, to their internet with these similar offensive techniques. So even if it were a good idea, which I think it's not, I don't think it would work. The answer is actually surprisingly simple. If we really want to make life hard for Russia, what we do is we change these weird features of Anglo-Saxon law, and we pass a law which say banks have to know the name of their customers. We make it harder for people to offshore wealth here by making anonymous real estate transactions illegal. We find a way to make Delaware, Wyoming, I forget the third state, which allow for anonymously registered companies to do that. Right? There's one building in Delaware which has 200,000 companies registered to it. This isn't just me being like crazy left-wing radical. This has direct implications for how Mr. Trump came to power. Between the day of his nomination by the Republican Party and the day of his victory, 70% of the purchases of his properties were by shell companies. Just to give one simple example, Trump and the Russians make contact for the first time in the 1990s because Trump Tower was the second building in New York to allow anonymous purchases of apartment units, and so the Russian mob started buying units from him for that reason. So this is a warning sign, right? It's a warning sign. So the interesting thing, and this is for the UK too. For the UK and the US, the things you could best do to constrain the Russians don't actually involve the Russians. They involve yourself. So when I look at like the expelling diplomats, I don't think expelling diplomats is actually that serious, right? Especially when Trump doesn't care about diplomacy. It's not, right? And the Russians have already expelled 735 or whatever it was of our diplomats last year. I think. I don't mean to be cynical, but I think in a way like that's a kind of fake Cold War drama, the expulsion of the diplomats. The real post-Cold War drama is the gray capitalism which is offshore, and that's that zone where East and West don't matter, and where people like Mr. Trump and people like the Russians can get together. So that's what I think. Yeah.
We're not the model of democracy we thought we were. We thought that the world looked to us as a model, but now the world is facing a crisis, and we're in the middle of this crisis of reforming or trying to regain our democracy. The crisis is climate change, with food and water shortages and climate refugees. And how are we going to, you probably don't have an answer to that, but the question in my mind is, how are we going to deal with that in the middle of this political crisis here? You do mention that the winner of the crisis in the Ukraine was China, who might in the future look to Russia's water and gas and oil resources, energy resources. So the worst case is a Mad Max kind of world where everyone is fighting for the remaining resources.
I can think of worse cases than that. So okay, three things. The first is, in 2015, I published a book, which I thought was my book about trying to save the world, which I raced to finish and threw a huge amount of effort into, because I had this sense that if we understood the Holocaust in terms of ecology and in terms of state destruction, it would help us to see, it would help us get us out of certain memorial holes, which had prevented us from seeing the connections between the Holocaust and our own politics. With great sincerity and a huge amount of effort, I put that book out into the world in September 2015, precisely with a mind to how climate change will makes genocide, among other things, more likely. I tried. I wrote that whole book. I really did. I did my best. And then time has gotten shorter, right? And so then instead of working on the medium term, I've been trying to work on the present. But you're right, of course, and there are answers to your questions. One thing goes back to the gentleman's question. The Russians are getting many things out of us. One of the things that the Russian establishment very much likes is a carbon-based economy. because that's what their wealth is based on. It's based upon natural gas, first of all, and oil, second of all. So when we ride along with, one more way we support the Russian regime is by being a carbon-based economy, much more than we have to be, right? So like if you care about Russia, you should care about, solar and fusion and all those things. But I mean, to answer your question, like as best I can, we can't, if we don't win on facts, we're not going to win on global warming, right? And it's another way these two things go together. You can't win with Trump and the Russians without taking a very self-conscious, I would say even naive stand about factuality. And likewise with science and global warming, we cannot win on global warming without winning on factuality. That's a precondition. So working on factuality is also working against global warming. At least gives us a chance. And then tactically, cities, states, corporations, getting other units besides the U.S. federal government to go along with the Paris Accords, right? Those things can be done.
I couldn't help but notice as you're speaking about the rule of law, as well as the importance of truth, which the politics of eternity attempts to shatter, I couldn't help but think of Robert Mueller. And the reason I say this is you were referring to the Internet Research Agency and also the beginning of its campaign beginning in 2014. We know those dates specifically from his indictment, Mueller's indictment. There's additional open source, reporting, but in that indictment, he detailed exactly what was done at what time in 2014 when they brought VPNs into the United States and so on. And he has a quote. I read his biography kind of recently, and I thought about it differently in the context of Road to Unfreedom. He said that he was always looking for ground truth. That's his term. And he said, what's really happening, not just what people want to tell you, which seemed kind of congruent with some of the ideas of truth and the importance of it, as you said. Now, obviously, Mr. Mueller is currently in danger of being fired. And my question then is, what is the responsible response from us should Mr. Mueller be fired? Because that's definitely going to be, he works at the Department of Justice. He's attempting to find the truth of what's occurring. So what is it that we as responsible citizens should do if Mr. Mueller is fired?
Yeah. So a couple things. The first is that it goes back to something which for me is very important, which is that factuality doesn't have to be partisan. Like there's a very strong conservative tradition, which Mr. Mueller is in fact articulating, about how you have to be skeptical and work your way through human passions and emotions back to the way things really are in their concrete reality, right? It doesn't have to be just a liberal thing. The factuality is something we all really need, and it's one of the most disheartening things for me, actually, in contemporary American reality, that particular conservative attitude towards truth seems to be so weak. That's the first thing. And I like the idea of ground truth. That's very nice, and it's and it fits very well with this notion of history as being a kind of accumulation of facts, which collectively work against what you want to think, right? So both inevitability and eternity are very comforting narratives, because like any big narrative, anything that happens, you can just plug it in. If something bad happens, if you're in inevitability, it's just a bump. It's a road bump, right? Everyone talked about road bumps, right, in the 90s. It's just a bump in the road. It's just a blip. If you're in eternity, every bad thing that happens, well, that's just the other people making our lives hard, And then the other thing that they do is once you're in those stories, you're not responsible for finding the facts, because the facts just sort themselves out. Basically, you don't have to do the kind of work that you're talking about. Second thing, I think it's very important for Mr. Mueller and Mr. Trump to be seen not so much as individuals, but as representatives of different worldviews. So Mr. Mueller does represent, I agree with you, he represents something like a basic attraction, identification with the rule of law, where rule of law means fact-finding and application of appropriate law to fact, right? Mr. Trump, and we should give credit for credit is due, he does stand for things, right? Mr. Trump stands for a different attitude, which is that might makes right. The rules don't apply to the big guys, they only apply to the little guys. In the meantime, you just make as much fuss and as much contradictory noise as you can. That's a coherent view, right? And these two views are now in a contest with each other. It's not personal. I mean, it's for the soul of the country, basically. So to get to answer your question, that's what On Tyranny is about. I mean, On Tyranny is about what we do in a situation like that. So of course, if Mueller is fired, every single way you can think of to protest, Every single way you can think of to protest, including mass mobilization, has to come. That is, it will be a critical moment. Whatever we've got to bring it at that moment. Yeah.
What you just said about worldviews reminds me of Paul Fussel's book on class, and I think maybe Trump does not share the middle class views that Fussell talks about in that book, whereas we expect people to share those views. But I just wanted to make a quick comment and a quick question. The comment is how much I appreciated when you said that virtue to the right wing and to the Russians is synonymous with heterosexuality. And I think that was so accurate, and one doesn't hear that talked about enough. But I think perhaps the word you were looking for was patriarchy. And patriarchy, the connection between patriarchy and capitalism has been made by Genevieve Vaughn and Heidi Gutner-Abendroth and other feminist theorists, economists. And when you talked about the weaknesses in the system that were exploited by the Russians, racism, the gun, the NRA, and the Electoral College, I think sexism would be another weakness in our system that could be exploited. So my question is, do you talk about sexism and patriarchy in your book? And if not, will you in your next book?
Thanks. No, that's kind, because it interestingly, those are places that I found myself in where I didn't expect to find myself at the beginning. So when I started this book, when I started thinking about the arguments that became this book, I was thinking about the protests in Russia in 2011, 2012, and I was thinking of the Maidan and the Russian invasion. That's where I was. But there were already signs back then, and especially in 2013, that the Russian self-description of what was happening, this Eurasia, this portrait of self as virtuous, had a lot to do explicitly with sexuality, with what I call in the book fragile masculinity. That's the ideal type I use in the book, and it emerged. And there's a personal preoccupation both with Secretary Clinton and with President Obama, which isn't just with them as individuals, but which is with her as a woman and with him as a black man, which is actually quite clear. I'm afraid I make it all too abundantly clear in the book because the Russian sources are quite, let's say, expansive on these points. But this is what you say is exactly what I try to do. Like I try to show how we could look at that and say, oh, those bad Russians with their sexism and their racism, or we could say, isn't it interesting, just for example, that the person that the Russians had been bedeviling, since 2012, Secretary Clinton, is the same person who's the subject of such highly personal attacks in 2016? Or isn't it even more interesting to note, and I spell this out in detail in the book, that in 2016, one of the two parties in our system, or its congressional leadership, decided that Barack Obama was no longer a legitimate president, right? Merrick Garland. And the Russians took note of that. It was a few days after that they hacked the Democratic Party, right? And then in the summer of 16, when the Republican leadership was presented with evidence that there was a Russian intervention, it was at that point already bound up in the notion that Barack Obama was not a legitimate president. Yeah. And that completely spoils our reaction to this. And so in a weird way, it is our own domestic racism which opens us up in 2016 for this to happen.
In terms of sexism, the connection with capitalism and patriarchy and communism is often gendered as female. And the only reason I got the courage to speak because I suffer under sexism, and I'm like, oh my God, I shouldn't talk because it's not feminine. But when you talked, you were grown up in Poland, and when you talked, I was so moved by your sense of urgency and this is real. And I was like, I need to talk because I feel like we need to do everything that we can to look at our culture and what is leading us to this. And I just came from the Modern Matriarchal Studies Day conference, which is really remarkable, and heard Genevieve Vaughn talk about the gift economy and how the gift economy is a parasite on the exchange economy, and that the gift economy is the matricultural economy, which used to be, it's a beautiful system. And I just think these, it gets into the weeds, really.
I'm glad you talked. So interestingly, in the chapter on Ukraine, the economy of gift actually features.
Oh, beautiful.
Because there was an economy of gift on the Maidan, which is just, anyway.
Yeah, and when was that?
2014.
Under communism?
It's in chapter 4. No, 2014.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going to keep this very brief. In 2012, Mitt Romney said that Russia was our largest geopolitical enemy. It seems between now and then that the American right has kind of bizarrely shifted to this Russophilia, whether it's in the alt-right trolls or with Trump or congressmen like Dana Rohrabacher. Do you think that's because of Russian infiltration and Russian propaganda on the right, or is it because the American right views Russia as a model of what they want America to be, a heterosexual, strongman state with oligarchy and, shadowy capitalism? So that's my question.
Yeah. So it doesn't admit to a simple answer, because I think different people and different groups are caught up with it in different ways. One answer goes back to this question. I think there are important Republican politicians who got caught up in a normal human political way. That is to say, when you don't resist something right at the beginning, you become complicit in the sense of being actively, and you have to then explain why it was you didn't do anything, right? So in 2016, something for me very dramatic happened, which is that the Republican leadership was told that an attack on American sovereignty was taking place. And this, by the way, is the most dramatic attack on American sovereignty as far as I can figure out in U.S. history. I mean, the British burned the White House, but the Russians decided who they're going to put in it, and that's more dramatic. And the reaction was colored by this story that I spell out in the book, that we've already decided that Obama's illegitimate. We're going to treat anything about Russia as being part of Hillary Clinton's campaign, so we're not going to defend the sovereignty of the United States. Once you decide, once you're a congressional leader and your decision is not to defend the sovereignty of the United States, it's going to be very hard for you to accept that there was a threat to the sovereignty of the United States. In other words, it's going to be very hard for you to look at what happened in the eye after. So part of it is that, part of it is the Russians rolling them on race, which I think is what happened. The second, you're also quite right that I put it this way, the Russians support, they support both sides in every controversial issue. But you can tell that they support one side with a great deal more pleasure than the other on some of these. So Russia actively supports the extreme right in Europe, and it actively supports what we call the alt-right in this country, and that love is reciprocated, right? I mean, if you go back to 2013, another person besides Mr. Trump who is defending Russia right at the beginning of their morals campaign is Richard Spencer, who appears on RT to explain how there's a new Cold War and it's all Obama's fault and so on and so forth. And he's not the only one, right? Oh, and Spencer's wife, by the way, is the translator of the most important Russian fascists, who figures in the book as well. So part of it is that the alt-right weirdly looks on Putin as a kind of white savior, even though, of course, Russia is in fact a very multinational, multi-confessional country, even though two of the 5 most powerful people in Russia are Chechens, and therefore at least of Muslim origin, right? They look at Russia and they see they see this whiteness. And Russia encourages them in that. So, but that's another group. And then there's also just a very banal phenomenon that a lot of people don't think Russia's a problem, just because Mr. Trump says over and over again that it's not a problem. Right, but I mean, but then in fairness, one has to say, first of all, Romney was right. Okay, on that, Romney was right. Secondly, during the campaign, Rubio also talked about this, and by the way, he had reason to, because remember, Russia's intervention on behalf of Mr. Trump isn't about the Democrats. It's about getting Mr. Trump in, which means they're already helping him against the other Republicans. Right, so Rubio has reason to be annoyed, and one should also mention that Kasich, well ahead of pretty much everybody, was saying that Trump and Putin were a problem. He even had bumper stickers which said Trump Putin 2016 in late 2015. So there certainly were Republicans who were thinking in a different way as well.
Well, yeah, along those lines, and thanks for everything you've done here. Yeah, following up, every time Trump says there was no collusion, many of us or most become more certain that there was collusion. Do you think it will come out ultimately that there was collusion involving Trump, or is that too much of a crystal ball?
So, I mean, what I find really interesting about the way that Trump talks about this and the way that we sometimes then echo him talking about it is that we define the crime. We define the version of the crime in such an unbelievably narrow way as to make it possible that he was innocent. I mean, we're talking about somebody who tweeted to 18 million people a Russian dump of emails, right? And I'm not going to say, I don't know if that's against the law or not, right? But it seems to me like whether or not, like for the collusion's not a legal question. That seems to me to be collusion, right? If the Russians steal your opponent's email and then you tweet it out, that seems like collusion to me, right? It seems like you're cooperating at that point. And, you know, and then I mean, but which I'm not gonna I can't rehearse chapter 6, but in chapter 6 a lot of what I do is I go through the chronology of 2016 again. I go through the Carter Page, I go through the Papadopoulos, I go through the Michael Flynn, who's an extraordinary character, Michael Flynn. I mean, Michael Flynn was retweeting Russia, Michael Flynn's was a Twitter follower of I forget how many, but it was more than a dozen totally fictional Russian Twitter accounts, and he was retweeting Russian material, you know, including like the spirit cooking thing, right down to the day before the election. Now, maybe he just didn't know, right? I mean, maybe the future national security advisor of the United States of America did not know that he was a conduit for Russian offensive cyber war. Maybe he didn't know, right? But it looks kind of bad to me. So I spend like chapter 6 with all of this, right? Yeah. So I mean, maybe Wilbur Ross forgot that he partly owns a company that was trading with a company that at the time was partly owned by Putin's son-in-law, right? Maybe that slipped his mind, right? It's entirely possible that just slipped his mind. You know, maybe Kushner forgot that he organized the Russian ambassador to be slipped into the top of Trump Tower through a freight elevator in order to organize a secret channel of communication between Trump and maybe, you know, who knows, right? But the thing is, like, that just goes on. I mean, in my book, it goes on for 60 pages, but that just goes on. And I think that what we do is, like, everything we learn, we say, okay, but what about the smoking gun? And here's the thing about the smoking gun. No one has ever found a smoking gun. No crime has ever been resolved because the gun was literally still smoking when the police walked into the room. That has never actually happened, nor will it happen. So what I think is that it's been abundantly proven that there was collaboration that we should see as highly morally condemnable. And I'm not going to be, I mean, there are going to be more indictments, and I have no doubt that there will be. With Trump, yeah, I think it's going to be very hard. It's going to be very hard to say that the person. Here's another little notion of like responsibility. He was in charge of the campaign, right? We flip it around. So we say like, well, everything that happened with Page, that was Page's fault. Or no, Trump was running the campaign, right? He's responsible for the behavior of his campaign. Like when Manafort is indicted, you know, the right-wing response is, well, that just shows that Manafort had bad judgment. No, it doesn't. He was the manager of the campaign personally selected by Mr. Trump. So, I mean, I think it's clear that I think it's going to become clear that Mr. Trump was part of a Russian operation which began long before the 2016 elections. It's inconceivable that he was unaware of this fact. Whether he will in the end be indicted and condemned, I don't know. But at a moral level, or at the basic level of American patriotism, right? It's completely absurd what he did and what he's been allowed to rationalize, right? I just can't see how anyone who believes that the United States of America should be an independent country, right, could accept that this kind of behavior is normal. So my basic line on this is that there is, and I try to show it in the book, is that there is a long and complicated story of cooperation which goes on for 5 years and which continues to this day. I mean, it's very striking that even as 16 months later, we finally begin to respond to what happened to us. Mr. Trump is still, you know, singing the praises of Mr. Putin, right? There is a reason for that. Yeah, you know, right. There's a reason. There's a reason for that. But I mean, with all of this, it's still down to us, right? I mean, what we have learned from all this is that it doesn't matter how grotesque the truth is. People still have to talk about the truth and make the connections and do things about it. There's so many things which we thought would automatically disqualify this person, right? It turns out nothing automatically disqualifies anyone. So much as I think that Mr. Mueller and the rule of law should be very closely connected, we can't just wait for the rule of law. The rule of law itself depends on the atmospherics that we create around it, our expectation that we really are in a rule of law society. Right? Thanks.